Welcome to our second study in Judges. This week and next week we're going to look at chapters 4 and 5 of Judges, the story of Deborah and Barak. We're taking 2 weeks to look at this story because the 2 chapters each give a unique perspective. Chapter 4 gives an historical account of the story, whereas chapter 5 gives a more poetic account. It's a song. More significantly, chapter 5 gives us a greater theological perspective. So we need to look at both chapters to really understand what's going on. We've skipped over a couple of Judges, so let me update you on where we are in the story. I told you last week about the repeating cycle throughout the book of Judges. Israel are disobedient, they're oppressed by their enemies. They cry out to the Lord and he sends a judge to deliver them. They enjoy a time of peace, but then they rebel again. Chapter 4 starts in a time of oppression. So let's read verses 1 to 3. Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord now that Ehud was dead. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. So Jabin, king of Canaan, is reigning in Hazor. Right away we see here a consequence of Israel's disobedience in chapter 1. If the people of Israel had trusted God fully and obeyed his command to drive out all the people from the land, the Canaanites wouldn't even be there. They certainly wouldn't have a king. But they disobeyed God and are now facing the consequences. And having allowed the Canaanites to remain in the land, Israel has become like them, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord has handed them over to Jabin and they're oppressed by his army commander, Sisera. We learn 2 things here about Sisera. He was cruel and he was powerful. You may remember I told you last week that iron chariots were the strongest weapons of warfare at this time. Well, Sisera has 900 of them. We'll learn a couple of other things about Sisera next week. But for now, we just need to know that he is cruelly oppressing God's people. And this happens for 20 years before they cry out to God for help. Well, we're introduced at this point to Deborah, so I'll read from verse 4. Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah, between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, Go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops, to the river Kishon, and give him into your hands. Barak said to her, If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course you are taking, the honour will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command. Deborah also went up with him. So Deborah is leading Israel at this time, but not in a military sense. She held court. Like a judge in a court of law, the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. Unlike the other judges who deliver Israel through battle, she leads from wisdom, judgment, and character. She's a leader who rules rather than rescues. In that sense, she's the judge who most clearly points forwards to the monarchy. She also points to the perfect judge, Jesus, who will reign over his kingdom with justice and righteousness. We're also told that Deborah is a prophet. She's God's mouthpiece, speaking his word to the people. This is important to note because when Deborah summons Barak, she is doing so at God's command, not because she's just had a bright idea. She's not acting out of woman's intuition, but as a leader God has specifically raised up for this time. And I think that makes Barak's response more understandable. There are two ways we can view Barak's response to Deborah in verse 8 and her reply in verse 9. One viewpoint is that Barak lacks Deborah's faith. He won't go into battle without her because he lacks courage, because he has more confidence in her presence than in God's promise. Her response to his lack of faith is to rebuke him. Because he lacks faith, he will not get the honour in this battle, but a woman will defeat Sisera. The second viewpoint is that Barak knows Deborah is God's mouthpiece, one who speaks God's words, and naturally he wants her with him. He wants to be able to listen to God throughout the battle. Verse 9 can also be translated, "On the expedition you are undertaking, the honour will not be yours." In which case, Deborah is not rebuking Barak for a lack of faith, but just telling him what will happen. To face Sisera's 900 iron chariots, knowing that he will not be the one to get the honour, would make Barak a man of great faith and humility. This is a viewpoint I lean towards. Barak will lead a relatively small army, just 10,000 men, towards a powerful oppressor and his 900 killing machines, knowing that he will not be the one to claim victory or rule Israel. And he will do so depending on God's word through Deborah. From a human point of view, there's nothing in it for him, but he goes despite every human disadvantage because he is a man of faith, and that's why he's commended in Hebrews 11. In his humility, he points forward to the perfect deliverer who would humble himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And we should be like him. As we serve God in faith and obedience, our concern should not be for our own glory, how we can enhance our reputation or popularity. Our job is to humbly obey whatever God calls us to do, and to trust him to give honour wherever he chooses. Now you may take the other viewpoint, and that's absolutely fine. Either way, we do know from 1 Samuel 12 that Barak was sent by God to deliver his people from the hands of his enemies. So Barak leads the fighting men out to Mount Tabor, and Sisera goes to the river Kishon with all his men and chariots. Now we can assume this was the dry season and there was no hint of rain. An experienced army leader like Sisera would never take iron chariots down to the river if he thought there was a chance of rain, because they'd get stuck in the mud. And because they're made of iron and very heavy, they'd never be able to get them unstuck. These greatest weapons would become useless, and that detail is going to be important later in the story. There's one other small detail that will also turn out to be significant. In chapter 1, we saw that the Kenites, who were descendants of Moses' father-in-law, had gone up with the tribe of Judah to live with them. They weren't Israelites by blood, but they had chosen to become part of the people of God. But in verse 11 of chapter 4, we see that one of them, Heber, has left the other Kenites and pitched his tent near Kadesh. Verse 17 tells us he's made an alliance with Jabin, king of Canaan. In the face of oppression, he's switched allegiances to serve the one he thinks will keep him safe. And we'll see shortly how that plays out. Let's read from verse 14. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot. Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all Sisera's troops fell by the sword, Not a man was left. When we read Old Testament narrative, it's tempting to focus on the question, what does this mean for me? Whose example should I try to copy? Who should I not be like? But the more important question we should be asking is, what can I learn about God? How does this passage show me what he is like? The story hinges around verses 14 and 15. Barak has done what Deborah told him. He's assembled his troops on Mount Tabor. And God has done what he said he would do. He has led Sisera's army to the river Kishon. Everything is set for victory, and Deborah fires a starting gun. Go! This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? The Lord has given the victory. The outcome of the battle is already determined. It's not dependent on the strength and ability of Barak's army, but on the Lord who has heard his people's cry and has marched out ahead of them to save them. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? So Barak and his men march down the mountain, and the Lord routs Sisera's army. They're thrown into confusion, and instead of ploughing through the Israelite army with their iron chariots, they flee before them. Barak and his men pursue them, and all Sisera's army are killed by the sword. The Lord keeps his promise and delivers them into Barak's hand. He is the real deliverer of his people. Next week, we'll get to fill in some of the details that are missing here, and we'll see even more clearly that God is the true hero of the story. But I don't want us to miss the finale, so I'll read on from verse 17. Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her. "If someone comes in and asks you, 'Is anyone there?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Sisera flees to the tent of Heber. Why is that a good place to go? Because he knows Heber has made an alliance with Jabin. Sisera will find refuge in the tent of an ally. Jael goes out to meet him and welcomes him in. She reassures him he's come to the right place. Exhausted from running, he lies down to sleep, and Jael tucks him in with a blanket and some warm milk. Then while he sleeps, she takes her tent peg and hammers it through his head into the ground. And just in case we're not sure what happens to a person who is hammered into the ground, the narrator tells us he died. Verse 22, just then Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera, with a tent peg through his temple, dead. So it's a rough end for Sisera, and although we know he was a cruel oppressor, you may have some questions about Jael. Is she good? Is she bad? She lies. She murders. She doesn't honour her husband and his alliance with the king. Well, we'll get to see God's verdict on Jael next week when we look at chapter 5. But let me make a few observations here. Firstly, her MO. To us, murder by tent peg seems particularly vicious. But Jael was just using the instruments she had to hand. Setting up and taking down the tents was typically women's work in this context, And so the tent peg and hammer were everyday household items to Jael, a bit like a dustpan and brush or a saucepan are in our context. Jael fought with her everyday tools, just as soldiers on a battlefield fight with their everyday tools of swords and spears. Secondly, she is God's chosen instrument. When Barak heard Deborah prophesy that Sisera would be delivered into the hands of a woman, he probably assumed that woman would be Deborah, and perhaps you did too. But Jael is the woman to whom God delivers Sisera. She is his choice. She has not usurped Barak by getting involved in a battle that is not hers. Rather, she has always been the one through whom God would defeat the cruel oppressor of his people. Next week, we're going to see why it is especially significant that Sisera dies at the hands of a woman. And lastly, her lies. Is it okay that Jael tells Sisera he will be safe with her when he is clearly anything but safe? I want to remind you of the point I made in the introductory video, that these stories are not recorded as instructions for us to follow. Jael did lie to Sisera, just as the Hebrew midwives lied to Pharaoh when he commanded them to kill all the Israelite baby boys. In both cases, the women lie to a man who is asking them to do something that is evil or something that will lead to great evil. In both cases, they do so at great risk to their own lives. And in both cases, they are honoured by God for their actions. And we'll see this more with Jael next week. So again, this is not a pattern to copy, but a principle to uphold. Faithfulness to God and obedience to his laws trump submission to his enemies when they are actively promoting evil. I'll say more about this as we work through the book, but for now the takeaway is that Jael was a brave woman of faith who honoured the Lord. And in a particular way, she points to Jesus. Back in Genesis 3, we read about the promised seed or descendant of the woman who would come and crush the head of the enemy, the seed of the serpent. We see throughout the Old Testament little pictures of this happening, seeds of the serpent like Pharaoh and Goliath, who are crushed by the seed of the woman, the chosen people of God. And here we have Jael, also a seed of the woman because she's become part of God's people. And she's doing exactly that. She crushes the head of this enemy of God's people, the seed of the serpent, with her tent peg. Like the other seed crushers, Moses, David, Mordecai and Esther and others, Jael points to the great serpent crusher, Jesus, who would crush Satan's head and destroy his power through his victory on the cross. And so this story is not gruesome, but glorious. For us, reading this side of the cross, it is a reminder that our champion has also marched out before us, and he is victorious forever. Next week, we'll look at chapter 5 and we'll see how great our champion is. I hope you'll join me then.